So most of this course is focused heavily on the experimental analysis of behavior, where our focus has been on scientifically understanding the fundamental mechanisms of learning and conditioning, figuring out what the rules are of what environmental contingencies cause behavior to increase or decrease, figuring out what behavior we'll get by setting up a particular schedule of reinforcement, figuring out what works and what doesn't at a basic rather than an applied level. But now we're going to pivot to focus even more heavily on real-world applications. So just as a reminder, back in that first video, we made this distinction between EAB, the experimental analysis of behavior, and ABA, applied behavior analysis. That's what we'll be diving into in these next few videos. Now, there are lots of people who work in the area of applied behavior analysis, even though that may not seem like part of their job title, and we'll see some of those soon. And of course, plenty of jobs involve using behavior analysis principle, even if that's not the person's whole focus. Like someone in advertising might use certain ABA tactics to increase sales, but they wouldn't necessarily identify as being an ABA person. But there is a career kind of specialty dedicated explicitly to applied behavior analysis, including levels of certification and testing by a national board. So the highest level for this career path is a graduate level certification where you become what's called a BCBA, a board certified behavior analyst. This is a master's level degree where you take coursework, but also need to accrue some supervised hours in the field, and then you take this professional exam in order to get that certification. As we'll soon see, BCBAs work in lots of different areas, but I'll give a few just example job ads so you can kind of feel out what it sometimes looks like. So, for example, just searching a job site for the term BCBA, this was the first one I ran into. This person would be working for an autism clinic, for example, which is one common area where applied behavior analysis is used, but by no means the only area. Notice that the BCBA would be doing assessments and designing behavioral interventions that have to be backed by scientific evidence, right? It can mean educating parents and caregivers. You do a lot of educating, training, directing, or supervising others maybe. So training those who work on your team, the behavior technicians who might be the ones actually more commonly carrying out the intervention plans that you designed. Or here's another example job ad for, again, a BCBA. Similar responsibilities list here. And you can see for the requirements at the bottom, they require a BCBA certification specifically. You'll find tons of these jobs out there just by searching for that credential, which again requires a master's degree to get certified. Now there are jobs in this field that don't require a graduate degree. So for example, with a bachelor's degree, you can become a board certified assistant behavior analyst, a BCABA. A little A in the middle. You may have to take some additional courses if you didn't take them when getting your undergrad degree, and you may need some supervised hours. You still take an exam, but then you can work as a BCABA and do many of the things a BCBA does, though the pay won't be quite as high. There's also a more entry-level kind of paraprofessional position called a registered behavior technician, an RBT, where you're definitely working under the supervision of a BCBA or a BCABA. That's often the person directly implementing the interventions that were designed by their supervisor. So this position doesn't require a college degree, just some training hours and an exam to get the credential. Often people who start here and get some experience in hours then go on to get their master's and become a BCBA, where the responsibilities will change, but also the pay is a lot higher. And just as a side note, you can go further than a master's and get a doctorate in applied behavior analysis. That's not nearly as common, and it's definitely not necessary. This credential is called a BCBA with a D after it, just adding a D for doctorate at the end. That's more common, in those who end up becoming a professor in the area or a researcher in the field. Or it can just mean, more money or responsibility, or it might make it easier to open your own big practice where you recruit and supervise other BCBAs. But honestly, the master's level is by far more common. Now, enough about job titles. What does someone in ABA actually do? I'm going to start with the kinds of things you commonly see for those working with kids, but similar principles and techniques often apply in other specialties. They just look different. We'll talk about some of that in future videos. So, generally at its heart, ABA involves analyzing existing behavioral patterns before then designing or carrying out some sort of intervention to try and change behavior. So that's basically like a baseline phase at the start where you're just analyzing what's going on. You're observing and identifying the behaviors of interest, but also the existing like antecedents, meaning what comes before the behavior, and the consequences, meaning what comes after it, in order to determine what's controlling the behavior, what's making that behavior happen, what's maintaining the behavior. In other words, you can think of this like the discriminative stimulus, right? That's our antecedent that sets the occasion for the behavior, makes it more likely in that circumstance. And then the reinforcers or other stimuli that come after the behavior as a consequence. So it's just our old familiar shorthand equation there, right? So the way this might look when working with a kid who's like, let's say doing a bunch of problem behaviors like hitting, kicking, and spitting on people or spreading feces and urine around, what we might do is list out the behaviors you're focusing on so you can record when they happen on a data sheet. So we just have copies and copies of this data sheet, and we're going to record over time through different sessions how much those behaviors are happening and kind of in what circumstances they're happening. So you're also going to track the antecedents, the things that show up prior to the behavior. Like, does this kid often use physical aggression behaviors right after being given work demands? Or right after there's some environmental noise going on, or right after a request is turned down, right? Or is it location based? Like, does the behavior often happen when he's on the playground or at the one-to-one desk with his therapist, or when he's in the classroom, or what, right? And you'd also look at the consequences that tend to come after these behaviors, right? Like, what kind of attention does he get when he does it? Does it sometimes lead to a tangible reward, like getting what he wants? Does it get him sent to the principal's office so that he's successfully escaping the classroom environment by doing these behaviors? Basically, we want to identify what is reinforcing and thus maintaining these behaviors. And also notice what consequences might be working to punish or lower the behaviors. And then obviously there might be kind of bigger picture factors or motivational operations that affect the behavior on a given day, even if they're not immediate SDs, like a med change or being sick that day or having his routine disrupted might be things that cause this. Basically, we build and adjust a data sheet like this to personalize it to the client, and then we're going to use it over time to collect data to understand those behaviors, understand the triggers and the reinforcers so that we can intervene to change the behavior and help. Now, generally, the BCBA will do what's called a functional analysis, a functional assessment, trying to figure out what it is that's reinforcing the behavior. Like, we do behaviors because they serve a function for us. So understanding that is foundational to then deciding how to best intervene. So just for example, with children, there are 4 really common functions of problematic behaviors that have been given the acronym SEAT, S-E-A-T. So some behaviors, they serve a sensory function. That's the S. Some others serve like an escape function to get out of an unwanted situation or activity. Some behaviors serve a function of getting attention, and some serve the function of trying to get you a tangible outcome, like a food treat or a desired toy, or of course, a behavior, might serve many of these functions. It might be tangible plus attention, tangible plus sensory, or whatever. So, for example, you might realize a behavior serves certain sensory needs for a kid. Like, some people may do some stimming, some self-stimulating behaviors like repetitive movements or sounds, and it may soothe them. In fact, all of us stim in some ways, like just twirling your hair unconsciously, kind of jiggling your leg during a boring meeting, all sorts of things. But for some people, like some of those on the autism spectrum, it may stand out more in a way that ends up causing some distress, like if it isolates or stigmatizes the person. Like a child with more severe developmental disability might have sensory behaviors where they like rub body fluids around. But if we determine that those behaviors are because they're seeking out that wet sensation, we could replace it with more hygienic and socially appropriate behaviors, like playing with silly putty or foam, or being given like a task to wash their desk that also happens to give them that sensory feeling that they desire. Or sometimes there's, like I said, not a sensory function of the behavior, but an escape function. So as we've already learned, escape behaviors are really common, just meaning behaviors we do to remove an unpleasant situation or stimulus. So if a kid in class is getting up and running in circles when they're supposed to be working on math problems, is the kid doing it to get the stimulation of physical activity, or is the kid doing it to get away from the anxiety or the boredom of the math problems? If it happens to be the latter for this kid, right, it might be different for other kids, but for this one kid I'm looking at, if it happens to be that they're trying to get away from those feelings of anxiety when the math is challenging, or feelings of boredom if the math is too easy, then getting up and goofing off behavior, that's serving an escape function for them rather than a sensory function. And we're going to have to address it differently in that case. We might work on why the activity was boring or anxiety provoking, or we might make the task less difficult if it's too frustrating, or more difficult if it's too easy. We might shorten the task time, work on things like that, or intersperse more rewarding tasks within it, or just beef up the reinforcement so the task itself isn't so aversive. Things like that. Or, like I said, the function of the behavior might be to get attention. If that's the case, then we have to address it differently than we would for escape behaviors or sensory maintained behaviors. Like a kid who annoys or picks on his classmate might be doing it to get attention from classmates or attention from the teacher. A kid who yells might be doing it because that's what in the past has led to everyone paying attention to them. So for this kind of behavior, we might, teach them more appropriate ways to get attention. In other words, use differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, a DRA plan, right? Or we might provide non-contingent attention, meaning we give them attention, but kind of randomly, like when they're not misbehaving. Think of it this way. Like a parent working from home might be stressed out and overwhelmed with work, right? So the parent is sitting at their computer, just getting stuff done. When their kid's being quiet and on task during that time, the parent is actually ignoring the kid, right? The parent just keeps working. Everything's working great. But when the kid misbehaves and acts up, that's when the parent stops work, stops ignoring the kid, and gives attention. Even if it's like a frustrated attention, like yelling at the kid to stop, right? So the kid in that situation was never getting rewarded with attention when he's quiet and on task. So the good behavior isn't actually being rewarded. Oops. He's only getting the attention when he does something bad. But if you change that and you do non-contingent reinforcement, give him attention at random times, not contingent on his behavior, just randomly shows up. So you're going to catch him when he's being good. Make sure to give some of that attention when he's not misbehaving. It's analogous kind of to a DRO setup, right? They're more likely to get a reward if they're not doing the misbehaving at any given time. And now they have a way to get that thing that they want, the attention. Meanwhile, you might use other tricks, right? You might use extinction by ignoring the undesired attention-seeking behavior. Now, with this one, if the kid is verbal, it can help at some point to emphasize to the kid that you're ignoring the behavior, not the individual, right? The kid needs to realize it's their behavior that's causing your ignoring, not themselves. But this is easy if you're also giving attention for good things. This is really just the same old lesson we learned about before in basic experimental analysis of behavior, where we learned about social disruption, right? And avoiding social disruption by also being the source of reinforcement for good behavior. Meanwhile, none of that's going to work if the function of the behavior isn't to get attention, but rather is their way of getting a tangible reinforcer, like a food or toy or access to an activity they desire, like video games or an iPad. When a dog knocks over the trash while you're out of the house, they may not be doing it to get your attention, right? You're not even there, but to get some leftover food that's inside of it. Or when a kid throws a tantrum, that behavior may be to get the McDonald's fries that they want, or to get more time with that video game. If that's a function, the function of their misbehavior, then you're going to address it differently. So you might work on introducing other items or activities into the individual's hierarchy of preferred activities or reinforcers. You might teach them healthy behaviors for accepting a no, or more calm ways to express their displeasure at not getting what they want. You might provide more environmental control over their access to the tangibles and provide a clear contingency for how or when they can expect to earn those rewards. You make it predictable and you make it contingent on good behaviors, and they now have an understandable system for how to get what they want and realistic expectations for how often they can. You also want to, catch the ways in which they're getting reinforced for those misbehaviors. Like, if you sometimes do give them the fries when they tantrum, or you sometimes do if they sometimes like do get extra time on their video games by misbehaving, then that's obviously going to maintain those bad behaviors. Anyway, the point here is you need to do a functional analysis, a functional assessment of their behavior in order to understand how best to tackle it with an intervention plan. Then that's the next step. So after observing the ABC, the antecedent, behavior, and consequence relationships, and doing a functional behavior assessment, then the analyst, as a next step, will develop a behavior intervention plan, BIP. Sometimes these are also called behavior support plans, but we'll just stick to BIP here. And a behavior intervention plan is just a plan to change the behavior of the client or the patient or the student using principles of behavior analysis. So this might include identifying alternative behaviors to reinforce, right? That's a DRA. Or thinking through what treatments might be most effective in this scenario, like, does it make sense here to use a DRO, or to use extinction, or to use negative punishment, or it could be like, setting up a written behavior contract, and so on. So here are just some simplified examples, like if the function of non-compliance behavior is escape and avoidance to get out of the situation, you might teach them instead how to request a break, or how to ask for help when they're confused. Then they're less likely to just escape the task randomly. Or if they're wandering around the classroom for sensory reinforcement, you might teach them how to request activities that involve movement, or you might build in breaks, or you might help them learn how to request breaks. Or if they're biting other kids for attention, right? You might teach them how to ask a friend to play and basically get them caught in a healthier behavioral loop where they get a lot of contact with social reinforcement and social attention in a nicer way. If they're doing tantrums for a tangible item, teach them instead to say no and shake their head when they're disappointed. Yeah, they're still protesting and not getting what they want, but this is a much healthier way to protest, right? So those are just some examples. Now, if the individual has language skills, we can use something called a behavior contract, which is basically just a way of formalizing and making explicit whatever contingencies we've set up, but you frame it in everyday language they can understand. Like, if I do behavior X, then I will get Y. It makes kind of explicit for them what the rule or expectation is, what we would call the contingencies, and what reinforcers available for it, or what the punishing consequence it might be for an undesired behavior. Basically, whatever contingency you're using, you let them know. You make it explicit in a language they can understand. That's a behavior contract. So this one on the left here is an example of a behavior contract with a young kid. It says, I will earn lunch with the teacher for 10 stamped points. I will not blurt out or comment under my breath during class and will follow school rules. I earn a stamp for meeting that behavioral goal during a time period, or I earn tally marks for the number of times I did not meet that behavioral goal. So the kid is working towards 10 butterfly stamps, right? And can see with those tally marks the periods when her behavior caused her to not get a stamp. So the connection is clear between her behavior and the outcomes. Or here's another example. So Mrs. Jones, the classroom teacher, will give Ricky a sticker to put on his classroom hero chart each time that he does one of the good behaviors, like turning in an assignment on time. When he gets 12 stickers, he then gets to choose from a list of rewards and can even earn bonus rewards if he had a perfect week. But also, if he misbehaves more than 5 times in a single period, he can't earn stickers the next period. So you're just making this explicit to the kid, and maybe also to the parents. They might have to sign off on this, right? But that's the idea of a behavior contract. Obviously, this isn't going to work as well with someone who has fewer language skills, but someone who can communicate verbally, right? We could use something like this. And sometimes we can communicate a contingency even without a lot of verbal requirements. So one common trick for that is what's called a first-then setup. This is just ABA talk for a contingency, an if-then rule. Behavior leads to reinforcement. That's all we mean by first then. But in ABA, they call it first then because it's easy for kind of anyone to understand it. First I do my spelling test, then I get to play on my iPad. And really, when a kid is doing some behavior, in order to get access to the iPad time, the reinforcer isn't necessarily the iPad itself, but rather the activity they do on it, right? The behaviors they really enjoy, like playing a video game. So in essence, what we're often using here is the pre-MAC principle. And just as a reminder, the Premack principle says that a high-frequency behavior will function as reinforcement for a low-frequency behavior. You might think of it in a kind of oversimplified way, like we will do a behavior we don't like if it lets us do a behavior we do like, or one that we like more anyway. So for example, Premack did a study originally with young kids where they had a choice between two alternatives, eating candy or playing pinball. He recorded for each kid, like which behavior was more likely. Some kids preferred candy, some preferred pinball. Then he tested his Premack principle. He tested the principle. In phase 1, he set it up so that playing pinball gives access to candy. Okay? So playing pinball leads to candy. It's a contingency. They have to play pinball if they want to get candy. So that's a horrible study for these poor kids to participate in, right? They have to play this game to get candy. Then he changed it. In phase 2, he did it the other way around. Now the rule is you have to eat candy if you want to play pinball. So candy leads to pinball. It's the only way. It's contingent, right? The pinball playing is contingent on eating some candy first. Now, meanwhile, in both of these phases, what he's measuring is how well the reinforcer worked as a reinforcer. Like in phase 1, he wanted to know how well candy would work to increase their pinball playing. How well does candy work as a reinforcer, meaning something that increases the behavior of interest, the pinball playing? In phase 2, he's recording how well pinball works as a reinforcer to actually increase their candy eating. So what he's measuring is how rewarding each of those things is to make other behaviors go up. So what are the results he found? Turns out the quote unquote reward, the consequence in each of those phases, the thing that came afterwards that was, being used as a reinforcer, it only actually served as a reinforcer for the kids that originally had that as their higher frequency activity. In other words, kids who preferred candy, they will increase their pinball playing in phase 1. But those other kids, the ones who didn't like candy as much as pinball, they like pinball more than candy, they don't increase their pinball playing in phase 1. The candy isn't serving as a reinforcer. It doesn't work as a reinforcer for the pinball behavior at all. It just doesn't increase it. But then likewise, in phase 2, kids who prefer pinball, those kids who happen to prefer pinball originally, they do increase their candy eating in phase 2, right? When the candy eating behavior gets them access to their high frequency activity. But for the other kids, the kids who like candy, pinball doesn't serve a reinforcement function. It doesn't serve as a reinforcement for candy eating behavior. So Premack's principle, his kind of super important insight here, is that the reinforcement power of an activity is relative. A chance to play a fun video game can serve as a reinforcer to increase some behaviors, but not necessarily other behaviors. Whether it works as a reinforcer depends on if it's more preferred than the behavior on the left side of the contingency, the one that it's going to allegedly serve as a reinforcer for. So that's the idea. Anyway, we use this all the time with first-then setups, which, again, can be pretty non-verbal, so they work not only with very young kids, but also those with like intellectual disabilities or language disorders. It's like a behavior contract. You're just making a contingency explicit here, but now we're doing it visually, right? We're telling them the rule where behavior leads to reinforcer. Now, one thing you've already probably noticed here is how common it is to use things like stickers or stamps or check marks toward earning a reinforcer when we're working with kids. These intermediate steps to a reward, they're often called tokens, and using it like this is called a token economy. Basically, the individual earns tokens by completing desired tasks or behaviors. Then tokens can be exchanged for something the individual wants, like an item or an activity. This helps avoid oversatiation if we're using food reinforcers, right? We want the candy to be a rare treat, not like we're just feeding them candy nonstop for every little behavior. And it gives us the power of intermittent reinforcement. And also, of course, it's just a more efficient way since we don't want to have to like stop and give them 10 minutes of video game just for solving one single math problem or doing one simple task. Otherwise, it would take forever, right? So one thing you might notice here is that it tends to be a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement, right? We're just giving them like a counter or a progress bar to keep track of their progress, but it's an FR5 or on the right here, an FR3 schedule, which means we can expect the usual behavior patterns of an FR schedule. We get a break and run pattern, meaning they'll take a break, a post-reinforcer pause after they get their big reward before they start building up tokens again. But once they start back up, it'll be pretty consistent behavior. Break and run pattern. We could, of course, use a variable ratio setup here for a token economy. And if we did, we would guarantee a more constant and steady behavior at a higher rate, if that's what we wanted, right? More like a slot machine, but of healthy behavior. But this is a lot harder to set up and maybe harder to communicate initially, especially to like a nonverbal kid. So FR schedules tend to be pretty ubiquitous with token economies. They're the most common by far. So here's an example of an ABA professional using a token economy to teach a kid, like to teach motor skills or language or other learning tasks.
In this video, I'll be reinforcing the behavior of task completion. Callan will be working to complete tasks, and as he completes a task, he will receive a token. This is the token economy system that I'll be using today with Callan. It's called Callan's star chart. Now, first I will start by showing Callan his choices of backup reinforcers that he could work for. Callan, what do you want to work for today? Okay, so Callan will be working for the iPad today. Callan will earn 1 star token for each of these jobs that he completes. When Callan earns 3 stars on his chart, he will gain access to the backup reinforcer of the iPad that he has chosen for up to 10 minutes. So Callan, you have to get 3 star tokens before you can get the iPad. Here's your first job. Awesome job. Here's your first star. Okay, sort your shape. Callan, you finished your last job. What does that mean?
iPad.
iPad. Thank you, Callan. Callan, are you glad you got the iPad?
So that's a token economy. Now, before we end this video, I wanted to discuss some core tenets of applied behavior analysis, what someone actually back in the 60s first formally laid out as 7 dimensions of ABA. So first, it should be behavioral, meaning we're focusing on observable and measurable behaviors, not vague mentalistic constructs. So we don't want to improve someone's mood with ABA because mood isn't a behavior we can observe. We might decrease the amount of time they spend in bed or increase the number of social interactions. We might even change their self-report behavior in terms of what they circle on a mood questionnaire, but those are all observable, directly measurable behaviors that we're changing. Second, ABA is analytic, just meaning decisions should be data-based. That's the measuring part. We don't do this by anecdote or by eyeballing things or following our gut. We use data. We graph things out and we do visual analysis or run statistics. Third, applied behavior analysis is technological, just meaning procedures are described clearly and concisely so that others, like the registered behavior technicians that we're supervising, so they can implement the procedure accurately. And it'll be similar even if done by a different RBT that's working, on a particular day. So technological, it doesn't mean high tech. It means like the root word of technique. But you can think of this as kind of doing things algorithmically, like setting out clear procedures. Fourth, behavior analysis and intervention, it needs to be conceptually systematic, just meaning interventions are consistent with the principles demonstrated in the literature. Basically, it should be evidence-based, science-based. We don't come up with intervention plans no matter how specific they are or how precisely we're measuring things if our intervention plans are just based on intuition and gut feelings. It should come from our understanding of the basic principles of learning and from the experimental analysis of behavior and from the ABA literature. And fifth, to be ABA, it has to be applied, meaning we're changing socially significant behaviors. We're focusing on behaviors that actually make a difference in the person's life or in a system, like changing the behaviors in a workplace culture or changing the behaviors at a country level to address climate change. Sixth, ABA requires generalization. So the skills and behaviors need to occur in environments other than where they were discretely taught. Like if the kid only learns to verbalize when they're in session, we haven't actually addressed the issue fully. Or if the teenager in our sex ed program only uses consent behaviors during sex ed class, but not when they're actually in the heat of the moment, then our intervention hasn't successfully generalized yet. And then finally, it should be effective. Like interventions need to be monitored to evaluate impact to see if it actually worked. So we use that data from the analytic bit up top in order to help us figure out what works and what doesn't. And if something isn't effective, if something isn't working for this particular subject, we change it. So those together are the 7 dimensions of ABA. So when we're thinking about doing applied behavior analysis, we should be keeping these kinds of things front and center. Like when we talk about a kid who's aggressive, we need to operationally define what we mean by aggressive behaviors, right? We're not making a kid less aggressive in terms of some inner personality trait construct that's called aggressiveness. We're making the kid do fewer aggressive behaviors, like hitting, kicking, biting, yelling, specific things like that. For the technological dimension, we work hard to be precise in terms of how contingencies are laid out. This ensures that we're consistent enough that the individual we're working with can piece together what the contingencies are, that they can learn the rules quickly and easily because we're very consistent in how we do it. So the more algorithmic and consistent and well-planned our intervention is, the more likely it'll succeed. I like this funny video to really kind of hammer the idea home.
You're not making any sense. Sorry, you ruined it on purpose.
You know what? I'm hungry. I could really go for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Do you guys think you can write down some instructions and teach me how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich?
Yeah. I'm done.
Step 1. Get 2 pieces of bread out. Got 'em. Get a butter knife and get some PB. Take 1 piece of bread, spread it around with the butter knife.
No, Dad, with the peanut butter.
I'm just doing what it says. It says take 1 piece of bread, spread it around with the butter knife.
Hold on.
Get some jelly, rub it on the other half of the bread.
No, Dad, open the jelly.
Well, it doesn't say to do that. Put the breads together on top of each other. Take a big bite. That doesn't taste like a peanut butter jelly sandwich. Fail.
Sorry, I had to make it extremely specific.
Oh, good. I'm starving. Take 2 pieces of white bread out of the bag. Take the lid off the jar of peanut butter. Get a butter knife and stick it inside of the peanut butter jar. With the knife, scoop a bit of peanut butter out
A bit, that means like a lot.
A bit means a lot?
In my world.
All right. There we go.
Doing better than before, though.
Open the jelly jar. Squeeze it onto the other piece of bread.
No.
Done. Closer. Get 2 pieces of bread. Get some peanut butter. Take the peanut butter knife. Open the peanut butter. Put the knife in the PB. Get some jelly. Open the jelly.
No.
Squirt the jelly onto the bread.
You're supposed to.
Take the butter knife with the peanut butter on it. Wipe it all over the piece of bread that's blank. Take the butter knife. Rub the jelly all over the piece of bread.
Oh, he's doing better.
It says all over. Put the 2 pieces on top of each other.
This isn't how I meant.
Take 2 pieces of white bread out of the bag. Take the lid off the jar of peanut butter. Get a butter knife and stick it inside of the peanut butter jar. With the knife, Scoop some of the peanut butter out of the inside of the jar. Spread your scoop of peanut butter onto one of your pieces of bread with a knife.
No!
Squeeze some jelly onto the other piece of bread. Spread the jelly on the bread with the butter knife. Put your 2 pieces of bread, peanut butter and jelly sides together. Done.
So that's why the technological part, right? The technique part, the consistent and clear part is so important. But getting back to some other dimensions of ABA, generalization is also a huge issue to keep in mind. So for discrete training in like a closed setting, like a clinic, a special classroom, whatever, it's important to eventually generalize the learning to more settings and other SDs and for, related responses. Like if you're training language skills, you want the individual to be able to hold conversation in general, not just a few practiced scripts that they worked on in the clinic. So what you do is you begin with discrete training, like a very specific ABC relation, antecedent, behavior, consequence. Then once they've learned it there, you start to train generalization using the principles we learned earlier this course. And we also want a lasting effect. So part of the behavior intervention plan often involves teaching operant responses that out in the real world will tend to contact reinforcement without the clinician needing to be there. In other words, you want them to start contacting existing contingencies in the natural and social environment. Well, we actually have a term for this. It's called behavior trapping. So once a behavior is learned and applied out in the real world, the behavior will be trapped by these naturally reinforcing contingencies. In other words, you won't need a behavior analyst or a technician to be there to provide reinforcement every time because the world will do so for you. That ensures the behavior they've learned will keep happening throughout the rest of their life. Finally, I'll save my comments on the analytic bit and the effective bit for the next video, where we'll see how to use research principles and study designs in ABA to evaluate if a behavior plan is working. So I'll see you in the next video.